When we think about agricultural systems, a lot of these ideas of competition in an ecosystem apply even though the system is being managed to optimize a particular plant product. And so we wanted to highlight a little bit about how ecosystem dynamics can be evaluated within agricultural production systems, with emphasis being placed on crop production systems today. So just wanted to start with a few focus questions of how much does a bushel of corn weigh? What is the optimum seeding rate for corn in Ohio? And what is a seed bank? And I bring these up because when we think about yield of corn, oftentimes it's referred to as a bushel. And a bushel is actually a unit volume, but it corresponds to a specific weight. And so if you're talking about yield in the US, often we refer to bushels, but elsewhere in the world, they might refer to it as kilograms. And so a bushel is essentially a conversion that we use in America to quantify yield. The optimum seeding rate is basically how many plants do you need in a given area to make sure that the bushels achieved on that unit land is greatest. That's what we mean by optimum seeding rate. And seed bank we'll get into in a little bit. So a bushel is a measure of grain used in agriculture that corresponds to a specific weight. For corn, 1 bushel equates to 56 pounds of grain. In soybeans, it's a little different. 1 bushel of soybeans corresponds to 60 pounds of grain. And when we talk about it per unit area, an acre is what we tend to use in agriculture, and that corresponds to 43,560 square feet, which is roughly the area of 1 football field. So when we think about plants per acre, it means how many plants do we need per football field to optimize our yield in that system. Just to sort of show some differences, we plant our crops in rows, but we change our seeding rate, which can affect the density or how close the next neighbor is within a row for these particular plants. Here we're looking at a picture of a corn plot that was planted at 24,000 plants per acre. So if you went through 1 acre and counted all of these, you should get this value. And this is a comparison. The same row spacing is employed, but the number of plants within the row or the density within the row has decreased to increase the seeding rate to 42,000 plants per acre. This is a fairly common practice, and it's possible that this might not be the best seeding rate to optimize yield, and this one may not as well. So where do we find that balance? And that's how we would determine our optimum seeding rate. We can think of seeding rate as basically a version of carrying capacity, or what's the maximum population size in a biological species that can be sustained by a specific environment. It's affected by nutrients, energy, water, and space. And so when we think about our carrying capacity from a seeding rate perspective, we are balancing this idea of decreasing yield per plant, as we see in the chart here with the orange triangles, over seeding rates as our seeding rate increases from 35 to 40 to 45,000 plants per acre, our yield per plant is decreasing. And so we're seeing that go down, but the rate of change of each response determines what our optimum seeding rate should be. We'll see that the per plant reductions are happening across the board here as seeding rate increases. But the overall grain yield per acre, so when we collect all of the seeds from all of the plants in that given area, we actually see a marginal increase in yield, even though the per plant yield is decreasing. Because the gains in plants, the yield from those additional plants is enough to offset the yield reduction per plant from having more individuals present in that situation. And so there's different versions of a response that we typically see. We can see a linear positive response, meaning that the more plants you add, the more yield per acre you achieve. Sometimes we see the opposite relationship. The more plants you add per acre, the more the yield decreases, and it's a linear relationship. Sometimes we see a quadratic relationship where initially adding more plants per acre increases our yield, but at some point yield plateaus or levels off and then starts to decline, meaning that the losses per plant are no longer being offset by adding more plants to that field. A fourth version that we sometimes see is a quadratic plateau, where yields are increasing quadratically to a point, at which point adding more plants doesn't necessarily increase the yield per acre afterward. And the response that we observe might be yield level specific. In low yield environments like we see in A, the linear decrease may be the most predominant version of what we see. In a medium yield environment, it might be more of a flatter quadratic or no real change. Basically, adding more plants is enough to offset the yield reduction per plant. And so it's a net change of 0. In a high yield environment, we might see something more like this, a quadratic relationship or a quadratic plateau, where we see really good gains with small increases in plant number, but after a certain point, yield kind of plateaus and we don't really gain much by having more plants, indicating a carrying capacity somewhere close to that optimum. In a very high yield environment, we might continue to see yields increase, and this is more of a linear positive relationship. So depending on the carrying capacity of that field, our optimum population may end up changing, particularly for corn. And so this yield environment does matter. When we see a high yield environment in Ohio, we tend to have a higher seeding rate being the optimum, with final stands at 34,000 or higher needed to optimize yield. In a low yield environment, typically the optimum yield is achieved with fewer plants per acre. And so across environments, we generally tend to recommend somewhere between 30 and 36,000 seeds per acre to make sure that you have enough plants there to get really good yield. But if you know the field that particularly yields well, you may end up planting more. If a field consistently yields low, you may end up planting below that range. Now, when we think about carrying capacity for plants, we're looking at seeding rates of 34 to 36,000 for corn, but weeds are also present. In general, we try to reduce the number of weeds because we're trying to maximize production of that one type of plant. And weeds are considered pests in this case because they rob the crop of water, light, nutrients, and space, and ultimately limit crop yield. The other reason why they can be a challenge in our production systems is the density differs. I mentioned 34,000 for crop density for corn is pretty good for a plant stand. The weed density can be almost somewhere closer to 1 million seeds or plants per acre. And that's just for one species. Sometimes there's 7, 8, 12 species present in a field. And so the density is a lot higher for weeds than it is for the crops that we plant. Also, they may end up leading to more susceptibility of the crop to diseases or insect feedings because the weeds act as alternative hosts. And so things that can affect impacts the weed as a pest are things like the life cycle, the ability to reproduce and come back, how it's being moved around, what the growth habit is, and what the growing conditions are. If they're favoring the crop, they're going to favor the weed as well. And the reason we talk about it is because it may not just be a problem for this year, but depending on its ability to come back, it may be a problem to come in years in the future. A soil seed bank is essentially a stable reserve of seeds in which additions are made and from which losses occur. So essentially, it's our reserve or stored number of seeds in the topsoil for potential weeds that we could have a problem with moving forward. Anytime we make an input, it includes seed rain or dispersal from those weeds, so adding seed to the bank. And a withdrawal includes things like seedling death before emergence, seeds being eaten by predators or pathogens, senescence and natural decay, and also human activities. Another loss that might occur from the seed bank is germination. Bringing back that weed can make it be from a weed seed to an actual plant, so it's withdrawing from the bank. But every species forms a characteristic seed bank, whether it's transient or persistent, and it can influence somewhat by the environment and also the tillage. So a transient seed bank is one that lasts for a very short period of time, and they tend to have regular opportunities for establishment. But if seeds persist for longer, there's tends to be more irregular opportunities for establishment. And so the makeup of the weed seed bank could be an indication of how that field has been managed in the past. Every habitat develops a characteristic seed bank in terms of persistence, species composition, and size. The history of disturbance can influence the seed bank. The history of weed control effectiveness can as well. The life cycle and history of crops grown can impact the seed bank by affecting what species are present. And the growth habit morphology of the crop could also affect the weeds that tend to survive and thrive in those environments. Looking at two theoretical seed banks here of a successional forest compared to an annual crop production field, we would expect to see a lot greater of a seed bank in a production field compared to a successional forest, with more species present as compared to a successional forest. This is in part because an annual crop production field gets a lot of sun that might have some disturbance. It provides new opportunities for colonizer species to succeed. Whereas a successional forest is established, oftentimes it's very well shaded, and it might be difficult for new species to come into that environment. The percent of seed bank in the top 3 centimeters of soil, or that's roughly 1.5 inches, 90% in the forest because there's not a lot of tillage. There's not a lot of soil disturbance, so the seeds that fall tend to stay on the soil surface. But this number is a lot lower in production fields because tillage could help to incorporate that and distribute it. We tend to see fewer annuals in the successional forest and more upright weeds in the forest, or fewer upright weeds in the forest because, again, it doesn't necessarily support a lot of that. It might be more of the prostrate growth, as well as perennial weeds like poison ivy and honeysuckle. We may not see those as much in the annual crop production field. So for the activities for this section, we have 2 that focus on seeding rate impact on yield production in corn, and one that provides an opportunity to see how survival and weed seed production affects populations. So the first is kind of getting to that idea of carrying capacity. The other is looking at longevity and seed bank dynamics as affected by reproductive potential and survivability of different weeds. So that's why we're getting to this idea of dynamics, is playing around with a few different models that have been developed to see if we can better understand the implications of decisions related to optimizing seeding rate, but also looking at different weed control practices. Each field producing crops is affected by environmental conditions, and the optimum levels to maximize yield can change with location and year. Sometimes other factors than seeding rate can impact yield, which can make production challenging. Weed control is key for production, and some species, due to reproductive patterns, can be more challenging to control. There's a few extending further activities that help to look at other factors like planting date and radiation presence for soybean planting date. So that's extending further 1. We also have a planting date by seeding rate interaction in corn, because over time, yield can actually decrease with corn because there's less radiation present. And so could there be a possibility that the environment affecting our production system influences optimum seeding rate in that scenario? So planting later, does it make us change our seeding rates more? So we can find that material here on our website in the ecosystem dynamics section. The slide set we just went through can be found there. The module itself can be downloaded from the site as a docx file. And so again, this is looking at ecosystem dynamics. I have K through 12 here, but this is probably more appropriate for upper level high school students given the amount of modeling. So with activities 1 and 2, students will tend to analyze data sets or collect data from experiments to determine an optimum seeding rate for a given environment. And a second set of activities will be to analyze different weed species for growth or look at seed banks that are actually collected. So for activity 1, this is a pre-populated data set where we have 3 different studies looking at 3 different seeding or different seeding rates for corn, as well as a 4th study. And the idea is, can we figure out the optimum seeding rate for these production environments? All of this material has been loaded into a Google Sheets document for you to use or look at. So this is activity 1 here. And essentially what we've done is we've taken our seeding rate on the x-axis and our yield response on the y-axis for our different studies. We've added a regression model to see what our optimum seeding rate would be, or our relationship between seeding rate and yield is. And so for study 1 here, the blue line, we see a negative linear trend. So our optimum seeding rate in that field would probably be our lowest seeding rate examined. For study 2, we see kind of this curved option. And if your students are taking calculus and are getting into derivative equations, essentially you take the first order derivative of this polynomial and solve for y equals 0, which is where the slope tangential to the curve is equal to 0. And that tells us our optimum seeding rate. So that's what we see here being calculated in the formula bar. For study number 3, we see a positive linear relationship. So our optimum seeding rate would be the upper end of that scenario. Again, study 4 is showing another one of these quadratic associations, with the optimum seeding rate being found at the peak of that curvature. If we return back to our document, we have some reflect and apply questions associated with activity 1. Activity 2 is a real-time plant density effect on plant growth. So maybe if the intensity of that calculation was too great, you can grow different number of species in a given area and see what the effects are on plant growth and development. And so this is something you can do a little bit different. You can seed 1, 3, 6, and 9 seeds per pot, looking at plant height, stem diameter, leaf number. How does having more plants present in a pot affect its growth and development? You could also look at different things in the field. If you have an association with a producer, you might be able to set up some different trials with different seeding rates and do this on a larger scale. We'd suggest at least 3 seeding rates for corn, possibly 4 if space allows it. And then after establishment, you can go through and collect some different yield estimates as well, if you get late enough in the season where you can actually collect that information. So the third activity, again, is pivoting more towards weed growth and simulation. So if we return back to our Google Sheets document and go to tab 3, we have 3 different species for this example. We have a pigweed species, a giant foxtail species, and common ragweed species, with different levels of production, which are biological estimates. These are germination percentages. We're assuming annual seedling survival and annual seed bank survival. So essentially of the seeds that are deposited, how much deteriorate, how much stick around. And so if we start with one plant of each species in the first year and assume that that plant germinates, we can get to our totals. And again, these will change over time based on the formulas that have been inserted into the Google Sheets document. So looking at this, we can see over time which species is going to be the most successful of the 3 that we've evaluated. In this case, in the first year, it looks like pigweed and foxtail are out competing the ragweed. But by year 3, the foxtail is the most competitive of the 3 species that we're examining. The interesting thing about this is if we decide to look at prolificacy and change this, for example, down from 20,000, change this down to 5,000, all of our calculations will update, and we can look at how that changes our spreadsheet calculation. We can also, instead of manipulating seed number, we can manipulate seed survivability. So let's say 40% survives. Does that change our results? These are things you can play around with your students. So if we change that to 15, how does that affect? So these are just some numbers you can manipulate in that activity to look at how different biological characteristics, germination, production, prolificacy, all impact the dynamics and how that changes potentially over time. Extending further, one is showing that planting date effect, we had a negative relationship at 2 sites, no relationship at a 3rd site. And then looking at seeding rate optimization, really there's no change in optimal seeding rate. It's just overall yield potential changes with our planting date. So if we return back to our document for looking at activity 4, again, this is the weed seed bank comparisons. If you choose to do the weed ecology, or you choose to do the ecology comparison activity, this might be a nice complement where you can collect seed from those wild environments and start to do some growing out in your classrooms. You can spread the soil on trays and allow them to germinate over time, and look and see if you can calculate how many species have come out of each and what those species makeup are, and maybe hypothesize why some of those are different from one another. So we just wanted to supply all of that information to you. There's a few extending further questions for activities 1 and 2. And again, what learning standards could potentially be met by working through these activities? You can find those here on the last page. And again, we appreciate your attention and hope that you find these useful moving forward. Thanks.